Next up, we have news about the FAA. And no, it doesn't remote ID. There's no news about remote ID. No, we talked about that. We got part 108. And Blunty, people are going to think this is a typo. Isn't it part 107? What's part 108?
Yeah, so we now have part 108. That's the new rules that we are looking to come into fruition.
More from the bullshit restrictions that the FAA is cramping our freedoms.
In some ways, but what part 108 really does, it's part of the Beyond Visual Line of Sight rulemaking committee. So we talked a little bit. If you guys didn't see it, we talked to Dave Messina, and you put out that video on your channel, and we had a good discussion with him about some of the stuff. And one of the things he mentions in the remote ID talks is that he's on the BVLS ARC committee, and basically the ARC is just a rulemaking committee that tries to develop rules and regulations for new things that they're going to have. So basically the FAA is like, look, we need rules for Beyond Visual Line of Sight. Somebody's got to do this. So they got a bunch of people together, and a bunch of people got in a room and argued together a bunch and developed rules. And these are those rules. And the idea of these part 108 is really not more restrictions, though in some cases it will be. In most of the cases, it's sort of ironing out things we've been confused about or that have not been like clear in the rules that are going to have to be clear moving forward, right? So one of those things is, sort of a question of, who has the right of way, right? Like right now we're supposed to yield to all manned aircraft, no matter what. Like that's the rule.
Unmanned aircraft must yield.
Yeah, and so if you think about moving forward, like, is that realistic for integrating drones into the future? Like, should UAS always have to yield forever, no matter the elevation, no matter anything that they're doing, right? And the BVLS, carves out part for that. So it basically says, if they're broadcasting ADS-B or transition awareness, then yes, we have to avoid them. If they're not broadcasting, it is no longer our responsibility to avoid them. They have to avoid us. And if we're operating below 500 feet or within 100 feet of a structure, they also have to avoid.
Now that's interesting because that starts to sound a lot like shielded operations.
Yes, so that's part of the idea here, is to carve out a spot so that there is a safety net, right, that we can live inside of. That while these rules build up around us, all these remote ID and other pieces, and eventually maybe the UTMs we talked about, internet management, all these things that could happen, right? We want to carve out spaces for us. And one of those spaces is going to start to be the shielded operation part of the BVLS laws that we're getting.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that this has potential to carve out some BVLOS allowances, which is useful because BVLOS includes long range. I mean, obviously, when we talk about BVLOS, the number one thing that is in the FAA's mind is like drone delivery and so forth, creating an infrastructure where you can have that kind of thing happening on a larger scale without interfering with manned aviation. Fine. And we think that's shitty and it threatens us, and we have bad feelings about that because we just want to do our thing. But BVLOS also includes flying a long distance wing, and it also includes flying FPV with the goggles down. And these are things that are currently not legal. And these are ways in which it is possible to move forward and have them become legal. And I know there's a lot of people out there. I mean, I saw it in the comments of my remote ID video. By the way, I want to say, Blunty, thank you so much for your help on the remote ID video. I know that you didn't actually ask many questions during the interview, but you and I and Dave talked for 45 minutes before the interview, and you came up with the original list of questions and sort of outline for the interview. I was like, hey, you got any questions that we could ask him? And then you just threw me this great outline, and I was like, oh, goddamn, that's half the work. So I really appreciate your contribution there.
For sure.
We saw that these negative comments from people who are like, F this all. And if your attitude is F this all, then by all means. I mean, I get it. I still think there's a lot of value in my theory is that you don't always have to obey the law, but if you break the law, it's good to know which laws you're breaking. And it's good to know that, like we could use cannabis as an example. Before cannabis was legal or recreational in a lot of states, there were a lot of people who smoked cannabis, and it was good to know about the progress of the laws.
Yes.
And that same thing is happening here. The laws may be moving in a direction we don't like. But in some ways, the laws may move in a direction that's better for us. And whether you say F the whole thing or whether you want to fly completely legally or somewhere in between, there's a lot of value in knowing and trying to make headway of any kind. That's what I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. I mean, it's inevitable. The point here is that we're carving out a space that we can be in. Like if this isn't written out, then we just don't get these rights. That's the way I'm looking at this. Right? We're going to get blanketed over because UAS is going to get regulated. So these are just positive to me because these are ways to find a future for us to continue to do what we're doing. And anybody who wants to do it compliantly, or at least partially compliantly, and stay out of the, compliantly enough to not bother anybody, will be able to do that. Right. I think that's part of the idea here. One of the other things that people are upset about from this, I'll just mention, is that this does recommend that there's a new rating for your pilot certificate. So like when you get your, like if you go and apply for recreational or 107, there might be an extra thing that you would have to get to be able to do those BVLOS. And so they don't like that, hey, there's a new license I have to have. But that license is sort of like, again, carving out a space that you can now live inside of the law, which to me is positive. Because, again, we're going to have to do this regardless. The other thing, just want to mention one more thing, is that it also defines acceptable level of risk. So people are a little concerned about this, but to me this makes sense because there's been a lot of arguments about nobody has done a a safety analysis, right? And then there's a lot of other arguments about like, how can you even do one? There's not enough data, like there's not enough flights there. How do you collect that data? Nobody's doing data analysis. The collection isn't proper. Like there's not documented. There's so many pieces to it, right? That you can't really get good data. So one of the things they define here is okay, we just are going to say there's an acceptable level of risk. And that acceptable level of risk is where we're going to live and what we're going to call UAS. And then at that acceptable level of risk, we're going to collect data under the laws you're going to allow us to use these devices in. And then we're going to build a history of UAS and show it's, how risky it is. Like we're going to, just like traditional aviation has a whole history and analysis and everything of it, we're going to do the same thing for UAS over time, right? That's the idea.
Yeah. Interesting. I think a lot of people are going to be hesitant about giving that data and them getting that data, or how they're going to use that data. I think about the people who accused Dave Messina and the FPV Freedom Coalition of selling out or some variant of that, and I really don't agree with that. It's like, let's say you've got this government body that is going to come up with this law or this regulation that is going to take away something that you think is valuable and that you think it's not right that they take it away. Okay, let's stipulate. I think everybody in the room agrees with that, and that's going to happen. And you can either be in the room and try to have a voice, or you can be outside of the room shouting on the street. Now, even if the person who's in the room accomplishes nothing, it's still valuable to have them there, and maybe they accomplish some things. And I think that's what we're seeing with the FAA and like the FPV Freedom Coalition.
As I mentioned a little bit in the remote AD video I've talked about here before, I have experience in cannabis, dealing with lawmakers and people who enforce laws in cannabis in multiple departments. I worked with, it's not just cannabis, right? So it's like we work with Marijuana Enforcement Division, Excise and License, Fire Department, police, like basically the Department of Agriculture, basically anyone who would be involved with any kind of anything, right? And every single group of them, every single person I talked to, even the total assholes, appreciated learning my opinion because it could inform their moving forward. And it made my life easier to give them my opinion and share it and move forward with things. We got changes in the law because of direct discussions I had with inspectors who changed how they were interpreting the law because they understood how it was being put into practice. Like this is something where like a lot of people were like, fuck the inspectors, fuck the law, like do everything you can to avoid them. Don't follow any of the regulations. Do what you've always been doing. Hide everything you're doing. Like there's that attitude is very prevalent in cannabis. Like don't let them regulate it. It should always be free. It'll never happen. Like all these kind of things. But there's a realistic point of view that like a lot of us have to take, which is like, this is going to happen. Well, and we have to be a part of it. And we have to find a way to find common ground and develop it better and make it like sustainable for everyone.
But I would slightly change what you said there, which is that we don't have to be a part of it. I mean, there are people who will say, I'm not going to be a part of this. I'm having nothing to do with this. I'm going to break these rules. And if they catch me, they can come and get me. And that mindset, I feel like there's value in that. If everyone just said, I will comply with whatever the law says, I think the world would be a worse place. But I think that the rebels also need to acknowledge that there is value in the quote unquote sellouts going into the room and saying, I know I'm not going to get everything I want. I know I'm barely going to get anything I want, but I am still going to show up at your effing meeting every day, and I'm going to represent my community, and you're going to hear my voice. And the rebels benefit from that, because if like one thing gets carved out that becomes legal, that would have been illegal, and the rebels were doing it anyway, that's one fewer thing they can ding you for if they decide they want to ding you. And I mean, that's something.
Sure.
Yeah. I think a lot of time the rebels think that the people who go into the room are not working for them too. And that if you really cared, you would just say F this whole thing. But if you say F this whole thing, then, you know, either you become Al Capone or eventually you get crushed.
Yeah. I mean, there's an inevitability to all this, but I will say that like all the people who denied the laws and made it much worse for people in Colorado and made the laws much shittier. Like all these dissenters and people who like didn't follow things and who like sprayed illegal pesticides and like who did all these like things and then the community found out about it. We got more laws because of them. So like, and maybe it's inevitable. Maybe somebody will always do that, but the dissenters just made it worse. Like we have more regulation. It costs more money to run a business. It costs more money to do legal cannabis because of their opinions and changes in what they did. So like, I understand where you're coming from, but at the same time, you can also fuck it up for everybody. Like, I don't know, like there are definitely regulations we would not have. And there are definitely opinions inspectors have that they would not have if they didn't walk into a room and find 5 gallons of myclobutanol that's known to give people cancer. Right. Like,
but let's bring it back to FPV. Are you saying that the people who are flying irresponsibly are effing it up they're making the regulations worse? Is that your opinion?
But it's also inevitable because someone will do it. Like, that's sort of what I'm saying.
There's always going to be some jackass out there.
Yeah, like saying it doesn't talk to anybody because nobody who cares is going to hear it, right? Like that's part of it too. Like that's part of what I say is like, it doesn't make sense to show a video of somebody doing dumb shit. All it's doing is publicizing dumb shit because anybody who's going to do the dumb stuff is going to do it anyway.
Right.
And they're not going to watch the video about you telling people not to do it. Like that's sort of where I'm at. But at the same time, it is a fact that those dissenters do sometimes make the laws worse. The question is like, I don't know. Again, like there's nothing you could do about it. Like, so you take the good, you take the bad, you take them both, and there you have the facts of life.
The facts of life. All right. Good discussion. I would love for more BVLOS things to be legal. The more things that are legal, the easier it is for me to pretend that I'm never breaking the law when I make videos.
True.
We'll have to bleep that last part out of the
out
of the replay.
Part of it is, one thing I'll just mention is I like to remind people is like, we don't see much enforcement based on videos. We see a lot of enforcement based on live streams or events that are seen in person or person's drones recorded, right? Because it's so much harder to prove a video. So
yeah, good. Yeah. I'll keep that in mind. All righty, next up.